Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the John H. Ames reading series. As you know, this is a monthly reading series we have up here in the Heritage Room. It's been going on for about 3 or 4 years now. I noticed one of our previous readers, Catherine Kidwell's here. Her book is also available in the gift shop. Our speaker this evening is Judith Nelson. Judith has a master's degree in journalism from the University of Nebraska, and she's currently the Senior Publications and Promotions Specialist at the University of Nebraska Division of Continuing Studies. She's also currently serving as the president of the Nebraska Press Women. Judith writes a newspaper column entitled Poor Judy's Almanac, and she is also author of 2 Regency romances, The Merry Chase, and also Kidnapped Confusion, which was released just this fall. Judith.
Good evening. I'd like to start out tonight with reading from my new book a little bit, Kidnapped Confusion, which was a September release from Warner Books. And I'm going to read from the very beginning of this to kind of set the scene for the book. It was one of her brother Charles' infrequent missives that set Margaret Tolliver thinking. He had sent it to inform her that he was making some slight adjustment in his investment of her funds, and from long experience she knew that the letter was informational only. Charles did not require or want her opinion on what he planned to do. Usually one to disagree with her brother in most matters, Margaret approved of his actions in this instance. She knew without doubt that he was as careful in the investment of her funds as he was in the investment of his own. And if, as Margaret suspected, that came less from familial affection and more from his tendency to look upon his sister's inheritance as his own, she was not unduly troubled. Charles had a profound dislike of dispensing with an unnecessary penny, and it made him a frugal agent in the long-term investment of her money. If that were not the case, Miss Tolliver would have had no compunction about removing him as her agent. Since he was such an expert manager of money, and since he was her only brother, and moreover one of whom she was fond, although she admitted fair-mindedly it was much easier to be fond of Charles when she was in Yorkshire and he was in London, she let him continue with the investment of her funds as he had done before she came of age. At first Margaret scanned the letter rather absently, wondering how it was that she and her brother had both learned their penmanship from the same tutor, but Charles had never mastered a hand that could be described as more than a scrawl. Her interest sharpened, however, when she reached the next to the last paragraph, in which he informed her that he would be traveling to Somerset a few days hence to visit a friend, and would not be back in London for 3 weeks. He gave his direction, but Miss Tolliver was not interested in that. What interested her was the information that he would be gone from the London house, information she digested as she folded the letter again and tapped it against the table. For several weeks now, Miss Tolliver had been experiencing a feeling of unease and a vague dissatisfaction with her life in Yorkshire, a life that usually pleased her greatly. It was Providence, she decided, that was sending Charles from London at a time when a trip there was just what she needed. She knew that now. Charles' letter made her realize that a chance to renew her acquaintance with those few persons among the ton whose opinions she valued, and to refurbish her wardrobe, to see the capital's sights, and be part of the city's bustle would soon set her to rights, and make her happy to return in due time to her tranquil living. And if her return to Yorkshire coincided with her brother's planned return to London, well, she would call it Providence again, and not a disinclination to spend time in her stuffy brother's presence. Never one to argue with Providence when Providence happened to please her, Margaret smiled and began to make plans. At supper that evening, Miss Tolliver announced that she would be traveling south to spend several weeks in London. Her Aunt Henrietta, with whom she lived, was vaguely surprised, but Miss Tolliver knew that all of her aunt's reactions tended to be vague, but agreeable, declining Margaret's invitation to join her by remarking comfortably that she and Lazarus, her pet rooster, were more inclined to country life. "Country worms are more tender than city worms, you know," Aunt Henrietta told her niece wisely, "and Lazarus has a great fondness for them." Miss Tolliver, who did not know the merits of country wrigglers over their city brethren, but who was much too polite and too little interested to say so, merely smiled and nodded. Over time she had grown used to her aunt's unusual pet, especially after Henrietta had, by means unknown to Margaret, house-trained him, and to her aunt's predilection for starting the statements of many of her own ideas or partialities with Lazarus says. If Aunt Henrietta and Laz did not care to stir from home, they had Margaret's blessing. She was relieved to find that her aunt had received the news of her trip so agreeably and turned her mind to other things. So it was on the next day that Margaret informed her staff of her impending departure, and by Thursday morning she had nothing left to do but to pack those few of her belongings that she did not care to leave to her maid to handle, to kiss her aunt goodbye, and to be on her way. It was during the last-minute packing that the most peculiar thing happened. Peculiar at the time, and, when she thought about it later, even more peculiar. Margaret had just placed her pearls in her valise and was reaching for the ivory-back comb and brush set that was a special gift from her late father, when Lazarus, who moments before was sitting quietly beside Aunt Henrietta on the bed as both of them watched Margaret pack, suddenly rose and jumped onto the valise, pecking at her pearls as if in an effort to pull them out again. An astonished Miss Tolliver picked him up at once and placed him on the floor, admonishing him with a "Lazarus, you silly bird, whatever has gotten into you?" The rooster, ignoring her words, ruffled his feathers and crowed loudly, making a great deal of noise in his throat and stretching and scratching in a way that she did not understand, but seemed to affect her aunt greatly. Without ado, Henrietta arose, lifted the valise, hurried with it to a cupboard, and stuffed it inside. Miss Tolliver was even more astonished. "Aunt Henrietta," she exclaimed, "what are you doing?" Her aunt gazed at her in surprise. "Why, I'm putting your valise away, my dear." "What?" "I'm putting your valise away. Lazarus does not think you should go." "What?" Miss Tolliver's voice rose in spite of her best efforts to control it, and Aunt Henrietta's surprise deepened. "But Margaret," her aunt said reasonably, "Lazarus just told you, and Lazarus knows." With a tolerant smile, Miss Tolliver removed the valise from the cupboard and, holding it tightly, asked just what it was that Henrietta thought Lazarus knew. Her aunt informed her it was not a thought, it was a certainty. Lazarus was telling them that if Miss Tolliver took this trip, something, and from Aunt Henrietta's tone it was an obviously ominous something, untoward would occur. "It's fate," Aunt Henrietta said simply. "It never does to tempt fate, Margaret. I'll help you unpack." No, Miss Tolliver said she would not. With a great deal of firmness and a disciplined grip on her laughter, she informed her aunt that she, Margaret Tolliver, considered herself mistress of her own fate, and that she was not going to cancel a trip to London on the advice of any bird, not even a bird with such high intelligence as her aunt's rooster. "Chances are it was only a cramp in Laz's leg anyway," she said with a smile, opening the valise slightly to drop in a bottle of her favorite scent, but not letting go her hold of it just in case the other woman should reach for it again. Aunt Henrietta's headshake was grave. "Lazarus knows," she repeated. "Fate is riding on this trip to London." Miss Tolliver assured her that she had her own fate well in hand, and with a quick kiss to her aunt's faded cheek and an equally quick pat on the back for Laz, she went gaily out of the room and down the stairs, cloak over one arm, valise in the other. When she arrived in London without mishap, she tolerantly shook her head over her aunt's musings and thought no more about it until later. Fate, grinning widely, sat back and waited. And if you've read the book, or if you read the book, you'll find out that Lazarus was right. Something untoward would happen because of this trip to London. The next thing I would like to read from is from my new book, Juliana, which was sent off to the publisher in September and will be out in April or May of '89. It's another Regency romance, and for those of you who don't know, Regencies are set in the time that Jane Austen wrote about. Jane Austen's the one that we usually think of as the writer for that century, and that's because she was there. She could do it firsthand. Okay, this is from the book Juliana. It was not the first marriage proposal Juliana Creston had received from her cousin Jonathan, and that might be why she was not attending. Her mind occupied by much more important matters, such as the knot that had worked its way into her embroidery and showed no signs of working itself out again. A visitor walking into the sun-brightened morning room in which she sat might have thought her quite alone, had they not caught sight of the eager young man standing for effect before the room's fireplace, his elegant head cradled interestingly on one well-manicured hand, his elbow resting comfortably on the mantelpiece. Another gentleman of a more observing nature could have been expected to notice that the lady before whom he was outlining the glorious deeds, plans, and actions he desired to undertake to ensure her happiness seemed remarkably unmoved. But Jonathan, never the most observant of fellows, was intent on the verbal flights and flourishes so dear to his heart, and which he believed incumbent on any marriage proposal, and was lost in his own long periods. When at last he eagerly inquired, "Well, Juliana, what do you think?" the young Viscount was surprised to find he had to repeat the question several times, Miss Creston being at that moment particularly engaged in disentangling that troublesome embroidery knot. At his second "What do you think?" Juliana raised her clear green eyes and said, with more feeling than tact, "I think that embroidery is one more of those foolish pastimes invented for women by men who don't like them very much." He goggled at her. "You think what?" "I also think, Jonathan," she said, surveying him critically as she reached in vexation for her scissors to cut the offending knot, that you should go home at once and change that ridiculous waistcoat." Her cousin's face, so eager a moment before, stiffened alarmingly. Too late, Juliana realized that she had been neither diplomatic nor, she was sorry to say, kind. She tried to palliate her faux pas with a smile, but Viscount Bushnell was having none of it. "Go home and change my waistcoat?" he repeated, astonished at her criticism. Like many of his friends, the Viscount considered himself complete to a shade, and was more used to being praised for the style in which he carried himself and the way his tall frame set off the most daring of apparel to advantage. He tried to remember the last time someone had had the audacity to criticize his choice in waistcoats. It had been, he frowned heavily. It had been several years ago, and the critic then, as now, was Juliana. Miss Creston, unaware of this sudden and regrettable improvement in her cousin's memory, nodded. "Something not as bright," she offered, turning from the large green and yellow stripes he wore as if they pained her. "Perhaps something in dark blue. Dark blue becomes you, Jonathan. Or you could wear claret. But those stripes—" She shook her head reflectively, sighed, and snipped the frustrating thread. Her cousin's face flushed, and Miss Creston changed her mind about his wearing claret. "I lay my heart at your feet, and you talk to me of embroidery, waistcoats, and color selections?" His high tone was spoiled when he added a moment later, in the voice of the 13-year-old boy who had found his 11-year-old cousin particularly tiresome, "And I will have you know, Juliana, that this style of waistcoat and these colors are particularly favored by the Regent." Juliana, who had her own opinions of the Regent as an arbiter of fashion, believed that even he would blink could he see her cousin now. One look at Jonathan's face suggested that it would be wise if she kept such thoughts to herself, however, and she did, starting to smile. "It is more sensible to talk of embroidery and colors and waistcoats than it is to talk of laying your heart at my feet, Jonathan. You have never done so." "I have," he protested, "times out of mind." "Oh," Juliana smiled again. "You have proposed to me times out of mind, to be sure, but what has that to do with your heart, my dear?" Thrown off his stride, her cousin glowered at her. "I don't know what you mean," he said stiffly. "If not my heart, then what?" She shook her blonde head, so close in color to his own golden curls, and her voice was soft. "I think, dear Jonathan, that your proposals have much more to do with laying your hands on my fortune than laying your heart at my feet." Viscount Bushnell, who had attained his title 3 years earlier upon the untimely demise of his sire, and who had, ever since, been busily dissipating the inheritance left him by that careful man, had the grace to blush. "No, dash it, Jew, I'm very fond of you," he protested. "Always have been." "But you find it easier to be fond of me when I have substantial holdings than you would if I had, shall we say, £1,000 a year?" "Well," her cousin, realizing this proposal was going nowhere different than his last 12, grinned ruefully at the companion of his childhood. "I'd still be fond of you if you had £1,000 a year, cuz, even if you had none at all." "Yes," her deep green eyes surveyed him tranquilly. "But I doubt your fondness would prompt you to marriage. You must be badly dipped again." "Yes, well," Jonathan shrugged philosophically, as aware as she that his proposals of marriage were always linked to certain pecuniary embarrassments. "I shall come about again. I always do." It was true so far, she knew. He had always come about, escaping or postponing the fall of an ever-increasing load of debt by a lucky wager, or backing himself to do some shocking and often dangerous deed. But she worried, and she knew his mother did too, that one day the right horse wouldn't outrun his contemporaries, or the right card wouldn't turn, and Jonathan would find himself with nothing. Genuinely fond of this cousin with whom she had grown up and who bore her such a familial resemblance that many people, upon first seeing them, believed the two to be brother and sister, she reached forward to clasp one of his hands as he stood near her, saying suddenly, "Do you know what you ought to do, Jonathan? You ought to find yourself a nice girl who knows how to hold house and retire to Bushy. My father was always used to say it is a very good estate, and I'm sure that if you put your mind to it and practiced a few economies for a while, you could soon have it back in shape to provide you with a quite comfortable—" Her voice trailed off as her cousin stared at her, his bright blue eyes wide, his eyebrows raised in real surprise. "Retire to the country, Juliana? Me? You must be joking." She was not, but his shocked gaze made her laugh, and she let go his hand with a playful slap, telling him that if he were wise he'd do so before he found himself completely in the basket. Jonathan, who at his particular stage in life thought the basket preferable to his ancestral dwelling, told her with feeling that she was a good one to talk, what with her London home and her Paris hotel, and her choice of several estates in various parts of the country to visit whenever she was feeling restless or peevish or in need of a change of pace or scene. "Seriously, though, Jew," he continued. For a moment she thought he was going to renew his petition for her hand, and, surprised, she waited. "About this waistcoat. Do you really think I should go home and change it?" He was startled when a richly vibrant laugh bubbled up. It amused her that, after all this time, thoughts still darted in and out of his head as they had when he was 9. Jonathan was a man definitely not given to brooding on a refusal that might have been expected to cut up all his hopes. She would not tell him why she was laughing as she assured him with as much solemnity as she could muster that the waistcoat did not become him. "But dash it," he protested, "I just had it made. Wore it specially for you. My tailor said it was all the crack." Juliana studied the waistcoat one more time, closed her eyes, and sighed. "Your tailor," she informed him, "lied." Yes, well, Jonathan ran a distracted hand through his curly hair and disposed his lanky frame in one of the leather chairs to her left. "Dare say you're right. Bunch of plaguey tradesmen. I know they lie about their bills because the amounts they say I owe them are not to be believed, while as for—" He broke off suddenly, realizing his cousin was watching him intently, and he straightened slightly to grin at her. "You wouldn't care to change your mind, would you, Ju?" She said she would not, and he shrugged. "Can't say as I blame you," he said candidly. "Dare say I'd make a devil of a husband. Would try to do things right, you understand, but, well," he grinned boyishly, "I do rather like to have things my way." "You and every other man I know," Juliana said, returning his grin. "Yes, well then." The light-hearted insouciance that always characterized him came to the fore, and he rose. "Guess I'll be off. No use cooling my heels here if—" He realized the infelicity of that remark and grinned at her again. "Sorry, Juliana. Didn't mean I wouldn't like to stay, but you have better things to do," she supplied. "Yes," he agreed, unaware that he had again blundered. "I do." He bent to kiss her cheek and gave her a slight pat on the shoulder. "Be seeing you, old girl." "Next time you're temporarily at a stand," she suggested, and he smiled. When he had reached the door, she stopped him by asking if he needed a loan, and he turned a scandalized face toward her. "Dash it, Juliana," he said, "I can't borrow money from you. You're my cousin, and a woman besides." "Yes, but Jonathan," she reasoned, rising to walk toward him, her hand outstretched, her rose silk gown rustling as she walked. "If I were to marry you, I'd still be your cousin and a woman, and you wouldn't have any problem at all taking my money, not just a loan, but all of it." "True," he agreed, "but then you'd be my wife. A man can take from his wife. Every man takes from his wife. It's expected. But it's a pretty scurvy fellow who takes from his cousin." Juliana did not understand his reasoning and said so. She told him she liked being his cousin, but did not at all wish to be his wife, and she would rather give him money as his cousin than have him take it from her if they were wed. Her voice trailed off as the expression on his face told her it was pointless to discuss with him the fine line between a cousin who is a wife and a cousin who is only a cousin. Instead, she shook her head and asked, "Is this one of those male codes of honor you're forever telling me about, Jonathan?" He said it was, and she sighed. "It is all very strange, I think," she said, and he regarded her with a lofty wisdom that seldom sat upon his tall shoulders. "That, my dear, is because you ain't a man." And with that irrefutable rejoinder, he walked out the door, leaving his cousin shaking her head behind him. The next thing I'd like to read tonight, I'd like to change times and places now and bring us up to the future, or really about 1980, with a book that I've written that's set in Nebraska. And this is a book that I'm trying to get published. I've been told by at least one agent in New York that no one cares what happens in Nebraska, but I do, so I intend to keep going with it. This is the setting scene for that book. Rising winds woke Kate that morning, seconds before the alarm shattered her half-slumbering state and brought her upright with one hand to her head and the other reaching out to silence the clock. With a sigh, she settled back against the pillows, half turned to the window where the curtain moved slightly, hiding panes that rattled despite her best efforts to winter-proof the old house. She closed her eyes and unbidden rose the image of the Chicago apartment, the crackling fireplace, the white furnace and thick carpets, the brass, the leather, the expensive pipe smoke hanging on the air. Her eyes opened, and with one motion she rose, pushing her feet into the sheepskin slippers that protected them from the cold wood floor. Pulling on her frayed flannel robe, she made her way to the bathroom down the hall. There she pushed aside the pink gingham curtain to gaze a moment at the rapidly swirling snowflakes that played against a still dark sky. "Great," she grunted at her reflection in the window. "Just great." Violently she turned the faucet handles, splashing icy water across her face without mercy, willing it to connect her with her surroundings, to bring her from the past to the present with its tingling awareness. 15 minutes later, dressed in a heavy sweater, jeans, and boots, she pulled open the kitchen door and pushed against the storm door. Already drifts of snow piled there, and in the yard light she could see white masses settling around the wheels of her pickup. How long, O Lord? The phrase rose from her childhood training as she shoved the door shut, pulled an old backpack from the coat rack on the kitchen wall, and slapped it onto a counter, stuffing it with the first food she could find. When the pack was almost full, she ran back to her bedroom for a nightgown, which she added to the contents. Then, pulling on her coat, gloves, a hat, and scarf, she turned to the door and opened it again. A whimpering dog appeared, and she scolded him for not having the good sense to crawl into the barn before she let him into the kitchen, warning him to keep quiet until Red awoke for the day. The dog seemed to understand as he circled 3 times and heaved a grateful sigh before settling on the rug in front of the oil-burning stove. Kate, wishing peace came so easily to everyone, pulled the door shut behind her, snapping her head down as the wind caught her scarf and tried to unwind it from her neck. With tight lips, she hurried forward, yanked open the pickup door, and threw the backpack onto the seat beside her. Pumping the gas pedal, she turned the key and slammed her fist against the dashboard as the engine spluttered and died. She tried again and again until the engine caught and held. Then her shoulders relaxed and she glanced at her wristwatch as she drove out of the yard. It was 5:35 a.m., and she was on her way. At the same time, another woman, younger, smaller, more untried, was headed toward the same destination, unaware of the snow falling around the bus in which she slept, a snow someone later would describe as this white hell, a wintry waste so in keeping with the white fog nightmares of her childhood that when she saw it, her throat constricted and her hands moved automatically to lift the fur collar of the coat around her neck. But that would be later. For the moment, T.J. McCormick slept, and she was one of the last awake on the Greyhound bus that morning. Annoyed and confused by the sounds around her, she wished crossly that her family would keep their voices down. As she came more awake, she realized her bed was moving, and, opening her eyes, she remembered the bus and her trip west. Sitting up, she pulled her skirt down over her knees, aware that the sailor across the aisle watched the act with interest. Looking up to glare at him, she was met with such eager friendliness that she found herself replying to his happy good morning with a stammered hello. Then she looked out the window as he informed her it was snowing. The sight surprised her. The day before, temperatures were in the 50s as the bus rolled through Illinois and Iowa, and it hadn't occurred to her that it would be any different today. Now outside, weekday light glared and disappeared among screens of snow, bouncing off whitened fields and making it hard to tell where the earth ended and the sky began. The further west they rode, the higher the snow drifted, filling in behind fences and easing over ditches until narrow fingers made their way onto the interstate to serve as point men for other flakes which followed closely behind them, bucking slightly as the bus raced through, the driver intent on reaching his destination before enough of their compatriots arose to stop him. He made it, too, pulling the bus into Ogallala only half an hour behind schedule, a feat he considered noteworthy, but one which had T.J. sitting on the edge of her seat, afraid she would miss the connecting bus which would carry her to Scotts Bluff and what, in her mind, she had come to think of as her new life. She need not have worried. The smaller bus which made the journey up past Lake McConaughey and through Ash Hollow had a driver who was not about to leave without any passenger who might add to the profits of the day. His was a shoestring operation, and it was luck and a number of odd jobs that kept the shoestring from breaking. The smaller bus was there in waiting when T.J. arrived, and she hurried toward it, only to find the driver and the Ogallala station master in heated argument. No, that wasn't right, she amended after watching them for several moments. The station master was heated as he urged the other man not to be a fool. The bus driver was supremely calm, obviously ignoring the good advice being poured into his ears by the thin man who stood a full head shorter than he. "Come on, Wild Bill," T.J. heard the shorter man say, worry vying with exasperation in his voice. "It's bound to be worse up north. No reason to get yourself killed for a trip you could just as well make tomorrow." About to reply, the bus driver looked up to see T.J., laden with luggage, standing uncertainly before them. A slight smile creased his lips as he asked if she was heading for Scotts Bluff. "Yes," she said, and took a step forward as the short man redoubled his efforts to talk Bill into staying in Ogallala, pointing out that it would be bad enough to kill himself, but criminal to kill someone as young as T.J. Listening, T.J. couldn't control the way her eyes widened at his words, and Bill's smile grew as he watched her. "You want me to stow that for you?" he asked, taking one of her bags, and she nodded yes while she stood, undecided, her eyes on the station master. "This is a bad storm we've got here, miss. Turning to a blizzard fast," the short man said gruffly. "My advice is to put up here for the day and go on tomorrow, or Saturday. Better to lose a day or two than your whole life." He turned on his heel after directing another ignored frown at the driver, and hurried back to his office in its warmth. T.J., staring after him, turned slowly back to the bus driver, who took her other bags without comment and thrust them into the storage area of his small bus. With a grunt, he also deposited the duffel bag of the sailor who had sat across from T.J. on the Greyhound, then watched with satisfaction as that young man climbed into his bus, took the back bench, and promptly fell asleep. "You coming too?" he asked, when T.J. showed a reluctance to move from the spot where she stood, the fast-falling flakes turning her into a snow woman. She bit her lower lip. What that man said, about storms like this being killers, she tried for a nonchalant smile. "That's not true, is it?" The man removed a half-smoked cigar from his mouth and spat. "Sure it is." "Oh." The word said a lot, and the driver, impatient to be on his way, stuck the cigar back into his mouth and swung himself up into the vehicle. "You coming?" he asked as he started the engine and looked down at a point somewhere beyond her left shoulder. TJ glanced around, trying to project confidence in a situation where she felt out of control and alone. Everyone else had disappeared in the rapidly accumulating snow. Her luggage was on board. The bus was headed toward her new life. It just seemed easier to go along. "Sure," she said, jumping up onto the first step. "After all, you wouldn't go if you didn't think it was safe." She said it aloud for reassurance, but was not reassured when the man said nothing, his lips curling into a sardonic grin, his dark eyes making it apparent he had little regard for safety. As the bus started forward, TJ fell into a seat and tried to assume the demeanor of the controlled reporter her 4 years in college had convinced her she was. It didn't work. After 45 minutes on the road, her eyes straining to see through the curtain of ever-whipping snow, the bus driver surprised her with a sudden, "Cheer up, darlin'. Wild Bill ain't never lost a bus yet." Temper prompted her to inform him she was not his darling, but before the words were out, the part of her that wanted to keep a conversation going to occupy her mind and to provide a focus on something other than the white cocoon surrounding them surfaced. She tried a smile, and the reporter's trick, a question. "Why do they call you Wild Bill?" His eyes danced beneath his heavy brow. "You don't want to know." "Oh." The word was deflated, even disgruntled, and silence fell again. TJ, cross that he did not play by the rules of polite conversation practiced at her parents' home in Connecticut, turned toward the window. She tried not to think of what her mother would say if she could see her now, riding through a Nebraska snowstorm in a minibus, really an elongated van, she thought disparagingly, piloted by a man named Wild Bill. Her father, too, she thought, one figure absently drawing pictures in the frost forming on the glass beneath her cheek. This was not what they had planned for their darling daughter. They'd wanted her to stay in Connecticut, to work in her Aunt Eleanor's public relations firm. And when, after several loud arguments on her father's part and several pointed, her parents said sulky, silences on her own, they finally realized she was serious about taking a job in Nebraska, they had wanted to buy her a car, or, her father said, she could have his 3-year-old Porsche while he got a new one, or, at the very least, a plane ticket to get her there. But TJ, unused to their opposition to her heart's desires, had told them rashly during one of their heated discussions that she was a grown-up now and didn't need their help, that she was going to take the small bequest left by her mother's mother to buy a bus ticket to Scottsbluff so she could see the country and meet people different from those she grew up with. There was a chance, she told them laughing, that she just might do some growing up herself. She meant it as a joke and was more than a little annoyed when they did not laugh. Instead, they nodded gravely as if they felt she could stand some. With the laudable goal of showing them, she'd packed her bags and set off on a great adventure, and now? Her eyes transferred to the thick black hair curling over the back of the driver's neck. He was different, all right. With a reluctant smile, she admitted to herself that her parents' plans for her life wouldn't bother her nearly as much if they didn't make such sense. Unwilling to pursue that thought further, she leaned forward, straining to see out the front window. "How do you do that?" she asked, and the driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Do what?" He stubbed his cigar in the ashtray beside him. TJ, unaccustomed to the acrid smoke the cigar generated, was relieved. "Keep the bus on a road I can't even see." He laughed. It was a big, booming sound laced with self-mockery. "Ain't you ever heard, darlin'? The Lord watches over fools and children." He paused a moment, then grinned. "I'd say that has us both covered." It took TJ a moment to assimilate his meaning, but when she did, her eyes darkened and she favored him with her version of Aunt Eleanor's famous freeze them where they stand stare. What worked for sophisticated Eleanor McCormick appeared as petulant little girl on her niece. "Are you saying I'm a child?" The bus driver chuckled. "Well, you do look a bit shy of experience, darlin'." He watched her color grow as he grinned again. "Besides, it's better than being the fool, isn't it?" "My name," TJ's voice was tight, "is TJ McCormick. It is not darlin'. I am 22 years old and on my way to a very responsible position with the Scottsbluff Tribune." Well, well, the bus driver was enjoying himself. "A newspaper woman." He considered. "Going to be the editor, are you?" "Of course not." TJ snapped the words, one hand going up to brush back the hair that always seemed to fall forward over her ears when she was angry. "I'm going to be a reporter." "Oh," Bill nodded knowingly. "Going to write about all the tea parties the ladies go to." TJ glared at him. "I am not. I," she emphasized the word in a way that made him chortle inside, "am a general assignment reporter." "Uh-huh." Wild Bill stroked his chin, apparently impressed. A triumphant TJ started to relax when he asked, "And what does a general assignment reporter do, Miss TJ?" "My name is TJ," she corrected him, chin up, "or Ms. McCormick." "Ah." The word was a long sigh, and he rubbed his chin again, glad for the distraction on a trip he knew he shouldn't be making. "Well, tell me, Ms. McCormick, what does a general assignment reporter do?" Visions of fires, government and police stories floated through her mind as she replied, "Anything the editor assigns." Bill had other ideas. Oh, he considered. You mean if the editor was to assign you to a pig beauty contest, you'd go and write about it. A pig beauty? TJ's mouth snapped shut as her temper rose. Now look here. Oh, they have them, darling, he assured her. I know. I've seen them in North Platte that you passed on your way here during Nebraska Land days. He let the words sink in before continuing. So would you write about that if the editor told you to? Well, yes, TJ conceded, but I'm more likely. Or if the editor needed somebody to write about the rattlesnakes up on Scottsbluff Monument, would you write about that? Maybe even take a picture of the snakes, too? Rattlesnakes? TJ's eyes widened. He nodded to himself, satisfied. Or, he continued, as if he were only considering, if the editor sent you to write about the fashion shows sponsored by the rich ladies of the town, you'd do that, too, wouldn't you? Feeling cornered, TJ raised her chin again. You don't understand. He cut her off. Ah, darling, I do. I've been a gopher, too. They rode in silence for nearly an hour after that, TJ resurrecting her dreams from the picture he drew, promising herself he was wrong, wrestling with the thought that her desire to take control of her life by coming here could be no more than exchanging her parents and teachers for an editor who told her what to do. He was wrong, she told herself. He had to be. Watching her face, Bill was sorry he had baited her. He tried to shrug it off, telling himself he probably should have thanked the first person who ever knocked his dreams out of the air and smashed into reality. He probably should have, but he hadn't. And I'd like to finish up tonight by reading a couple of columns. As was mentioned earlier, I write a column weekly for a paper in North Platte, Nebraska, and a paper down in Kansas. And because of that, I often do write some seasonal pieces. And so because of the Christmas season, I thought I'd finish with a couple Christmas columns from last year. I came upon it by accident, this previously undiscovered diary of a woman gifted by her true love on the 12 days of Christmas. In it she wrote, Dear Diary, on the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a partridge in a pear tree. I appreciate the thought, I think. But what on earth does my true love imagine I am going to do with a partridge and a pear tree? Yes, it's a small partridge in a small pear tree, but where should I put it? And what happens when the partridge wants to get out of the pear tree? You hardly ever see anyone out walking their pet partridge. I don't know if there's a partridge leash law, or if you can teach the little cluckers to heel. Somehow, I get the feeling my true love still bears ill will about the pair of electric socks I gave him last year. I'm not sure you understand, but I can't help wishing he would have taken my hint and gone instead for the leather gloves I pointed out each time we were in a store the last 6 months. Ah well, subtleties are lost on some men. Dear Diary, it is the second day of Christmas, and my true love gave to me 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. Swell. There are 2 birds cooing up on the top shelf of the hall closet, and pear trees et al. Serving as bookends on the coffee table. I remember the TV show The Partridge Family. It was never like this. Dear Diary, on the 3rd day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and, you guessed it, another partridge and pear tree. If that isn't bad enough, the delivery man is beginning to grin broadly each time he comes to the door. My living room looks like a hatchery, and there are 8 days to go. Dear Diary, on the 4th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and my 4th partridge, which is a nice bird to visit, but I wouldn't want to live with 4. Any way I look at it, my true love is saying you are for the birds. I'd ask him, but he is not answering his phone. Smart man. Dear Diary, hooray, hooray! On the 5th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 5 golden rings. No complaints. Except that I'm going to have to hawk them to buy feed and build coops for the 4 more calling birds, 3 more French hens, 2 more turtle doves, and who knew there were that many partridges in the country? Dear Diary, I'm sorry I missed writing you yesterday, but I have been so busy herding livestock, no bird stock, that I didn't have a moment to bring you up to date. On the 6th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 6 geese a-laying and the rest of the whole menagerie. I had just gotten them quieted down today, threatening them with visions of becoming comforters and pillows if they didn't quit their honking, when the doorbell rang. There, special delivery, were 7 swans a-swimming, 6 more geese a-laying, and all the other little critters that are making me feel like I'm living a scene in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. What does one do with 7 swans a-swimming? At present, they're tucked in the bathtub. It is not the same as taking a soak with a rubber duck. And if that isn't bad enough, the swans don't speak to the geese, who don't talk to calling birds, who can't understand the French hens, who cluck at the turtle doves. None of us is speaking to the partridges. From now on, I will not answer the door for fear of being gifted to death by my one-time true love. Dear Diary, I suppose my not answering the door is the reason the delivery man left the 8 maids a-milking on my doorstep. And what do maids milk? Cows. Along with today's supply of swans, geese, calling birds, hens, turtle doves, and another partridge in a pear tree, it made quite a sight. which is what the health and sanitation man said when he stopped by to tell me I am in violation of the city's ordinance against keeping livestock in the city limits. The rest of the gold rings are going to pay the fine. I thought the electric socks were a good idea last year, honest. Dear Diary, this afternoon I peeped out my barricaded front window to see a large crowd gathered in my yard watching the 9 ladies dancing, another gift from you-know-who. May I never see him again, but oh, I wish I could get my hands around his neck. Luckily, they all went away when the police stopped to inform them that they need a dancing permit if they wish to ply their trade in the city. Unluckily, although the ladies left, they failed to take with them the assorted birds, maids, and cows. I am thinking of starting my own dairy. Also unluckily, they did remember the gold rings. Dear Diary, I was awakened with a start this morning by 10 lords who came leaping in through the bedroom window, the front door being blockaded, as you know. I did some leaping of my own, straight out of bed and under it. I stared aghast at the flying figures, accompanied by 9 more ladies dancing, 8 more maids a-milking, and assorted inappropriate swans, geese, calling birds, French hens, turtle doves, and another partridge in its own pear tree. There was no sign of the gold rings. I wasn't surprised. I shouted at them to leave, but they would not. Instead, they dragged me kicking and screaming from under the bed and demanded that I join them in a mazurka, which might have been fun if my landlord hadn't chosen that precise moment to appear at the window. He informed me, most rudely I thought, that he was not running a lunatic asylum, and that as at the end of the month I am evicted. Thank you very much, my ex-true love. Dear Diary, I can barely hear myself think today. Throughout the house, 11 pipers are piping while lords leap, ladies dance, maids milk, swans swim, geese lay, birds call, and I go quietly crazy. What worries me most is I am beginning to have a fondness for little partridges. Dear Diary, I look at it this way. Not everyone has 12 drummers drumming as they're marched off for disturbing the peace. In fact, no one else in the neighborhood has lords a-leaping, ladies dancing, maids a-milking, swans a-swimming, etc., etc., etc. For that, they are devoutly grateful. I plan to go quietly with the nice officers. Perhaps they'll take me to a place where I can plant pear trees and raise partridges. Attack partridges in case I ever again encounter the jerk who started this whole thing. In the meantime, remind me to write Santa. I need a new true love for Christmas. And then my last column is a more serious piece about an old legend that I grew up hearing about, and it's one that maybe you're familiar with too. There is a legend that the animals talk at midnight Christmas Eve. I've read that if you slip down to the barn at that magic hour, you'll hear cows tell of how their ancestors gave up their manger for a small child's bed. Sheep say it was the wool of their clan which made a blanket to keep the child warm, and small donkeys, usually the most humble of creatures, recount with pleasure how their forebearer carried the child's mother safely on her long and tiring journey to Bethlehem. Up in the rafters, doves coo their centuries-old lullaby, and there is, if only for a moment, the realization of the miracle of it all, experienced by the simple and the lowly. I love that old legend. I've never gone to the barn on Christmas Eve to see if it is true. Part of me thinks that even if I heard only a moo, I'd believe the animals were speaking. It's just that their words would be in a tongue unknown to me. I think that, I guess, because in this season of belief, I am a believer in miracles. I am not alone. Each day proves it. With every card and present that arrives, we experience the miracle of friendship. And we who through the years grow a little older, a little tireder, and a little bit more dismayed at all that remains to be done in this world, feel our hearts rise up in wonder. Amidst all the suffering, amidst all the tribulation and winter chill, there are people who are eternal springs in our lives. They are the candles in our darkness, our shining miracles of hope. Each year at this time we hear a great deal about peace on earth, goodwill to all people. That some of us still believe it possible, still work for it and hope for it and pray for it is a miracle, the miracle of the human spirit. Within many is a striving to be better than we are, to rise above what is in favor of what could be. All around us are tales of pain and sadness. To pick up the newspaper is to read about man's cruelty to man. And yet we go on in our day-to-day lives, working, believing, caring, trying one more time than we ever thought we could try, and every now and then, if only in small ways, succeeding, giving us courage to continue. There are those who will tell you that this is a season of grief and over-commercialization, but I am not one of them. Amidst all the hype and hoopla, genuine sharing and caring prevails. Here and there, a child on Santa's lap asks that the kindly old saint remember a brother or sister as well. Strangers exchange smiles, and bell ringers call out Merry Christmas. Families head for Christmas Eve services on cold, crisp nights when the air bites right down to your lungs, wrapped in a warmth of traditional belief and sharing. Inside the church, small children lisp their ways through the timeless story, dressed as angels and wise men and shepherds. Young and old together raise their voices in praise of that silent night and proclaim that there is joy to the world, and all are part of the Christmas miracle. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I appreciate it.